Mature perceptions. To keep anger from being sinful, we must more and more develop our knowledge and understanding of ourselves and others. Here now is Gene Getz.
When you read this principle, you can very clearly see that it assumes that all human beings get angry. And it also assumes that you can get angry without sinning. Now, how do we know that's true? Well, let me take you to the Apostle Paul when he wrote to the Ephesians. And here's what he said about anger. Be angry and do not sin. Now, that's about as clear as you can get, that not all anger is sin. In fact, it's almost a command. In essence, I think it says, in your anger, do not sin. In other words, you're going to get angry, but don't sin in the process. And he goes on to say, here's how to avoid that. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, and don't give the devil an opportunity. In essence, what happens when you allow anger to linger, it can lead to bitterness, and bitterness can lead to serious sin in our lives. Now, the fact is that the Apostle Paul was actually quoting from Psalms, Psalm 4, where we read this, be angry and do not sin. It's almost an exact quote. On your bed, reflect in your heart and be still. Wow, there's a lot of wisdom there, isn't it? When we get angry, one of the things that is very, very important is to back away and reflect, to get distance. Boy, I found that true in my own life. Just recently, I became quite angry over a situation. And I was going to do something about it immediately, but I'm so glad I didn't. Because my perceptions were not accurate, not totally accurate. And most of the time that happens. We perceive things that are not exactly accurate. Or even if they're accurate, we need distance in order to respond properly. 24 hours for me gives me a whole new perspective. That's why I've put it into practice over the years is if I write a letter or an email, is to write it and then lay it down. And a lot of times I come back, tear it up, never send it. Because my perspectives are different. It's a good therapy, by the way, to write it down, to get it out of your system. That certainly is one way to avoid sinning in the process. So Paul is dealing with it here. It was stated here in Psalm 4. He was quoting from Psalm chapter 4. Now, how do we keep anger from becoming sinful? Well, here in the Proverbs, chapter 14, 17, 19, we have some tremendous wisdom in answer to that question. Look at Proverbs 14:29. I've called this great understanding. A patient person shows great understanding, but a quick-tempered one promotes foolishness. Now, in essence, what that is saying is that the basis of patience is actually knowing that if we get understanding, we will do things in the right way and we will not sin in the process of our anger. But if we are quick-tempered and we respond immediately to that action, chances are we're going to sin in the process. So great understanding is very important. Here's another one. I've simply called this next one restraint. The intelligent person restrains his words, and one who keeps a cool head is a man of understanding. You know, when you study the subject of anger, particularly from a secular point of view, one of the theses that's developed is you can't control your feelings. Now, in some respects, that's right. But these Proverbs tell us that we can control our feelings if we have the right perception of events. That helps control our feelings. Without correct perceptions, it's hard to control feelings. They happen. But if we develop understanding, restraint, perception about human nature. It helps us to actually control our feelings, in this case, our anger, and to understand why. Here's another one. Insight. It's a similar statement, a little different nuance, but a person's insight gives him patience, and his virtue is to overlook an offense. In other words, if we develop insight into human nature, insight into ourselves, insight into how we function, insight into how others function, our children, other human beings, it actually gives us control over how we are going to respond or how we're going to process the feelings we have, even to overlook an offense, to be willing to forgive. And so consequently, these Proverbs are really powerful in relationship to this principle. Let me state that principle again so you get the connection. To keep anger from becoming sinful, we must more and more develop our knowledge and understanding of ourselves and others. And that's a lifetime process. Question for application is simply this. Why is controlling anger so important for parents, particularly in rearing children? Well, the Apostle Paul has a lot to say about that with a few very concise statements. When he wrote to the Ephesians, for example, he said, fathers. Now, notice he's addressing fathers here, and I think that's significant. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Why is that statement so important? One reason is that children identify God the Father with their earthly fathers. And so their view of God and how he feels about them really develops naturally as to how their fathers feel about them. And so consequently, we really need to take this very seriously. Paul did. In Colossians, very similar statement, but a little different nuance and application. Fathers, do not exasperate your children so they won't become discouraged. Now, you and I know that that's a very intricate balance. For one thing, not all anger is sin, and children need to know that their parents get angry. That's human. They need to understand that. And children do understand that when we explain it. For example, I remember one time when my son, now grown, was just a little guy, was stirring his iced tea. And to me, it was very irritating. We're sitting at the dinner table, and he's clank, 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 with his iced tea. It's going on, and I just said, Kenton, stop. It was just a habit. And he said, oh, okay. But a minute later, he was clank, 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 clank. And I said, Kenton, please, I ask you, don't do that. It irritates me. Oh, okay, Dad. About a minute later, clank, 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 clank. And I remember saying to him, Kenton, I want you to look at me. That makes me angry. And he said, oh, okay, Dad. And he stopped. In other words, he understood anger. Why? Because he feels anger. We all feel anger. So children need to understand that anger is not sinful in itself. I remember growing up in a home, and in some respects I hesitate to share this because I don't want to reflect on my dad. He was a wonderful father. I think one of his great traits was patience. And to be honest with you, I don't ever really remember him losing his temper and getting angry. Well, as I grew up, looked back, began to understand that Dad did get angry, but he repressed it. And so consequently, he became passive-aggressive. He expressed his anger, but it was in ways that was passive, and that's what happens. That's a tendency. When we don't handle anger properly, we can become passive-aggressive. And as I looked at that, as I thought about that, then I began to realize why I felt so guilty as a believer when I got angry. Because I saw modeled in my father that you don't get angry. But he did. He just reflected it through more passive-aggressive behavior, which, by the way, is one of the biggest problems a lot of us have as men, is being passive-aggressive. So what I'm illustrating is children need to understand anger. They need to understand that adults get angry, parents get angry, but we are to express it in appropriate ways. And so there's a balance here in relationship to this concept. Paul puts it very clearly. Be angry, but in the process, don't sin.